Let's paint a picture together. You're scrolling through Instagram and you come across one of your favorite creators' new posts, and you think to yourself, how the heck does their footage always look so high quality, cinematic, crisp? That, my friend, is the power of color grading. Enter Dehancer, a powerful film emulation plugin designed to give your digital footage that authentic cinematic film look. Now, there's a lot of talk around town about these emulation softwares and whether or not they actually get the job done. Well, that's what we're going to explore today, and I'm going to walk you through the Dehancer plugin within Adobe Premiere on my Mac. The plugin's available in other post-production tools like DaVinci. So without further ado, let's dive in. So once you download Dehancer on your device, you're going to just want to launch your post-production tool of choice. If you are new to the color grading world, typically best practice is to create different adjustment layers for the various steps within your color grading process. So the first step is adding a conversion LUT if you're shooting in log profile, for example. So if you're shooting in a picture profile like S-Log3, for example, the footage just looks grayscale as is within a Rec. 709 environment. So you're gonna have to convert that clip in order to adjust things like saturation, shadows, highlights. So then the second part of the color grading process is the color correction. And that's a second separate adjustment layer. So this is really just getting the image as similar as it would have looked like in real life with your eyeballs. And then the third and final step of the color grading process is, well, the final color grade, and that usually just adds a unique look, aesthetic. If you want to make your footage look more cinematic, that's usually when you get to play around with a bit more of the creative settings. And that's really where Dehancer's power comes in, especially if you're just getting into color grading, like I said, and you're not creating your own LUTs already. This is a great way to give your footage that unique look without worrying about knowing all the ins and outs and spending countless hours on days on weeks trying to get that right look. So without further ado, let's start using the plugin. So if you're just downloading Dehancer for the first time, you're opening it up for the first time in your post-production software, you're gonna need to do a couple things to get started. Because I've already walked through this process, I'll just talk through what you can expect and show you how to set things up properly. So I've already created the 3 adjustment layers here, as you can see. So step 1, like I was saying, is converting the clip. So I'll just put that adjustment layer on top of the zebra clip here, and I'll drag and drop the Dehancer Pro plugin on top of there. So you don't see it now because I've already gone through this whole activation process. But the first time you do this, you will see a watermark on your clip. And to get rid of that watermark and to activate your subscription, you're just going to go within the Effect Controls panel here and scroll down to the Dehancer Pro effect. And then all the way at the bottom of the list is license info. So again, because I've already activated my subscription within Premiere, it says activated, it's good to go, but you'll have a couple different options of how you can activate your subscription. The first one is just using your login credentials that you've created when you bought the subscription, or Dehancer might give you an activation key that you can also use. That being said, I've already activated it, it's good to go, so I'll just close that window. So in order to convert this clip from S-Log to Rec. 709, we can go down to this input dropdown. And for the source, you're just going to want to select the source of the original clip that you're trying to convert. So it's not shot in Rec. 709, it was shot in S-Log3. So I'm just going to go to choose camera. And if this dropdown menu says load profiles and restart plugin, again, mine doesn't say that. I have all of the profiles already loaded here. You just scroll back down to where we activated the license, and you're just going to click check profiles, and then it's going to load all your profiles and update all your profiles within the tool. And then you'll just have to restart Adobe Premiere or whatever post-production tool you're using from there. And once you do this, your drop-down menu will look like mine. Okay, so now that I've converted my S-Log3 clip to Rec. 709 through that adjustment layer, I can move to the second step of the color grading process, which is basic color correction. So I'm going to drag and drop that adjustment layer on top here. And again, this is where I want to make the image look realistic. So for the color correction step, I'm just going to use the settings that are built in within Premiere. And then I'm going to use Dehancer in the third and final step of color grading to really give my footage a pop and unique look and aesthetic. So in Premiere, you can totally just use the sliders. I personally have been using the curves a lot more lately. And during the color correction process, I actually open up my scopes here. So if you're not familiar with these graphs here, let me give you a little bit of a breakdown. So this graph on the right here is the Vectorscope, and that's going to tell you color composition within your clip. So let's say, I'll use the sliders just for this example, but let's say I take this slider and I put it all the way up and make it super, super pink. Notice how this starts to veer toward the pink. I'll just undo it. Or let's say I'm moving the saturation up like crazy. You'll notice that the yellow and greens go up more because that is what the composition is primarily made up of, is like yellow and greenish grass. So for the color correction phase specifically, you're going to want to make sure that this dot in the middle stays within the middle as much as possible. That being said, if you have a clip that has more red in it, it's totally normal for that to veer a bit more toward the red. But in terms of just getting the basic color correction down pat, we kind of want to keep that dot as balanced as possible. And this little graph on the left is your waveform. And that's essentially giving you an idea of the brightness or luminance of the clip that you're editing from left to right. So if the white specks are touching the 100 line up top here, it means that your footage is clipped and it's way too overexposed and you lose the details that are within the clip. Whereas if the line gets lower to the 0 mark, for example, if I bring the exposure down all the way, some parts are hitting the 0 mark, meaning that it's purely black and we don't have any details. You're just going to want to make sure that all of the white on this waveform falls within the 0 to 100 mark, depending on the footage. Ideally, you properly exposed it while filming, so you won't have to tweak it too much. It's a pretty well exposed clip, in my humble opinion, I hope. That being said, we can make it a little bit crisper, higher quality, in my personal opinion, by reducing the highlights ever so slightly. So to do that, you just take this dot here and you drag down the highlights here. I'll show you how it changes as we adjust the highlights. So see, when the highlights are higher, the zebra stripes, not that they're clipping, but it's very, very bright on the sides. Whereas bringing down the highlights ever so slightly kind of gives us more distinction between the black and white stripes. And again, even though the whole point of the color correction process is to make the clip look as close to the original thing as possible, you can still add a little bit of your personal preference here in terms of what you think looks good. And I think that looks like more of the real deal because, again, it gives us a bit more depth and it separates the zebra a bit more from the background. Now, decreasing the highlights means decreasing the brightness as well of the clip. So if you bring down the highlights quite a bit and you're like, now I'm finding it's a bit dark, even like holistically looking at the clip, yeah, I find it could be a bit brighter and make the zebra pop a bit more. That's when you can play around with the shadows here and bring them up to make the zebra really pop out from the background. But that being said, like I'm even like playing around with it now and I'm like, ooh, like I kind of like it even like a bit darker because we kind of see the sun hitting the zebra a bit better. I don't know, like if we look at his face here. With my eye, I actually like that it's a bit darker and we can kind of see the light hitting him a bit more by decreasing both the highlights and the shadows. And you can still do what you think looks best with your eye, but it's still good to have the Vectorscope open because it'll at least still show you what's going on technically with the brightness throughout your image or the exposure throughout your image. Personally, anywhere between like 90 to like 10 is like kind of ideal. And again, this is all dependent on what the video is actually of. If it's a bright image or has a lot of whites in it, it makes sense that the bulk of this will be closer to that 100 line. Whereas if you have a darker image, maybe something shot like at night or something moody in like a dark alley, whatever you're shooting, I don't know what you're into, then maybe you'll notice that the white veers a bit more toward the 0. So it's about playing around, seeing what looks good with your eye, but also trying to keep in mind that the white parts really should never, ever exceed 100 or go below 0. But in my humble opinion, anywhere between 10 and 90 is optimal. So I look at this image and I'm like, that's pretty accurate to what it should look like. That being said, I do remember the grass having a bit more of a pop and it looks a little bit dull and dry now. So if we wanted to adjust the RGB curves for specific colors as well, that's totally something we can do. And to make this grass pop a bit more, we can do that with the hue versus saturation graph here. So because the grass is kind of a mix of like yellowish, greenish colors, we can just create 2 dots. This might have a bit more orange in there than it seems. And then I pull this up. See how the saturation now moves up with the surrounding grass and not just the green. So now if we zoom out, see how much more the grass pops. And then if we bring it down, it all kind of goes gray. Okay, so now we've color corrected the clip and added a conversion LUT. And the beauty about working with adjustment layers is we can see what we've done for each step so far. So if we go back and just look at the original clip, so this is log footage as is out of the camera, but then once we added conversion LUT, we have this image, which is way more realistic to what we saw with our eyes while shooting that clip. But it's still not 100% realistic to what we saw with our eyes, so we added very minor color correction on it. So now the third and final step of our color grading and color correction process is actually adding the final look and color grade, and that's where Dehancer comes in. So I'm going to drag and drop the color grade LUT that I've created here on top, and we're going to go to our effects panel here and search Dehancer. And then we're going to drag and drop that plugin on top of the color grade adjustment layer. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh my god, I just color corrected my clip and I was really happy with it and now it looks like this. But don't worry, this is just the default film look that Dehancer puts on your clip when you add the plugin on top. And I'll show you now how I refine the color grading adjustment layer to give it my specific aesthetic look that I'm looking for. So once that plugin is added, we're going to scroll down to the Dehancer Pro menu item here within the effect controls. Personally, the first effect I like to adjust is the film look, just to get rid of that default look if that's not the aesthetic you're going for. So there's tons of different film looks and profiles that you can choose from. And I'll just quickly show you a few of my go-tos depending on what the aesthetic you're looking for is. So if you're looking for that classic orange teal LUT that a lot of intro color graders abuse, Kodak Vision 3 500T will probably be your best bet. Fuji Eterna Vivid 500 is another one. It looks quite similar. You just get a bit more contrast, I find, in that one. It looks a little less faded. If you're going for a little bit more of the aesthetic and faded look, I personally find Kodak Portra 400 does a good job. Or another good option would be Fuji Color Pro 400H. If you're going for more of a dark and moody kind of aesthetic, I find Kodak Vision 3 500T is a good option. Or Ilford HP5 Plus 400 is like just straight up black and white. Now because this is Safari content, I really want to give it that warmer Savannah vibe, but we can now play around with this film look and really make it look like we want it to. So the push-pull EV is an interesting setting, and that's actually going to show you what it looks like to push and pull the film back within the development process. So the further we go this way, it gets more blue, and then all the way up to 2, it's a warmer image. So now that we've selected a film look, we can go into the film developer and just going to want to make sure that it's enabled. So for the contrast boost, for example, and if you want to make sure you're still following best practice in terms of having proper exposure on the video, we can open this scopes. I'm just going to move it over here. Oh, it's very small. And see how much white is touching that 0 line down here. So it means that while I was editing the contrast of the film look, I dragged it up way too high now because it's touching that 0 line. So we can drag it back down again. And we just want to make sure that it doesn't touch that 0 line. Now, gamma correction is going to allow you to adjust your midtones. So it doesn't directly affect the whites and the blacks in the image, but just everything in between. So gamma correction, if we try to increase it, like by a lot, for example, you're going to see that the image gets quite bright. And then when we decrease it, it gets quite dark. So you'll kind of notice that it still hovers within the 0 and 100 mark, whether it's all the way up or all the way down. I think I'm happy at 20 for gamma correction because it still falls within that 10 and 90 line that we were talking about. The color boost, on the other hand, is what's going to make your colors pop more within the image. So as you can see, the saturation goes up like crazy. Again, I wanted to give it that like Savannah style look without it just look like completely burnt grass. Maybe make it a bit more poppy. So now this is what the film look looks like with and without the developer settings we just adjusted. So that's with and without. So we're quickly already seeing bit by bit that Dehancer's tools and settings we're adjusting along the way really make for a richer, more dynamic image. I love that we see the sun setting, like that's what we see with our eyes, is the sun hitting the zebra. Because of that, we can separate the subject from the background way easier. The grass does look quite yellow and saturated, so maybe I'll just decrease the color boost ever so slightly. And again, we can go back into the color correction tab and adjust the curves that we were playing with earlier that brought up the saturation in that grass. And that's why it's so handy to work with adjustment layers, because now I know like, oh, I'll just go back to the color correction adjustment layer and adjust the curves for saturation for that. So now that I'm adding that like look, I can decrease it a bit so it's just not as in your face. So now when we enable and disable those settings, that is what we're left with. Now, I'm really happy with that. So now we can move on to film compression. So rather than harsh clipping that we see with digital sensors, film naturally compresses these stark highlights and shadows, making for an overall smoother image. So when we increase the impact of the film compression, it pulls back super strong highlights and increases very dark shadows to give you an overall balanced image. So for example, the more and more I pull up impact all the way to 100, the sky looks a bit more blue because it's reducing the whites. Whereas when we pull it back all the way to 0, the sky gets a bit lighter. So it just depends on, again, the look you're going for. But I do like it at around 75 for this image. I think that looks good. So tonal range controls how much depth you get within your image. So the higher this amount, you'll see the contrast goes up, and then the lower that amount, less contrast. So I think for this image specifically, I really like it around 52. If you don't like the film grain that gets added to your image by default, which personally, not a huge fan of, it just makes it look noisy. It's, again, if you're going for that effect, great. If not, you just want a clean image like me, we can go down to film grain here and we can just toggle it off. Now the last couple things that you can play around with that Dehancer is better known for is the halation and bloom effects. Maybe you want to make your footage look like a dreamlike state. We just walked through the full color grading, color correction process step by step, starting with applying a conversion LUT. So here's the raw footage shot in log. Here's the footage with a basic conversion LUT. Some basic color correction I did just using Adobe Premiere's settings, curves, and I also referenced the Vectorscope and Waveform to make sure exposure and colors were accurate. And here's the final film look we achieved with Dehancer, aka the color grading. So in short, do I recommend Dehancer? 1000% yes. It streamlined the color grading step effortlessly. You can either use their presets or adjust them and customize them to your specific needs. So thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful, and you can check the description below for a discount code that you can use to purchase Dehancer for yourself. If you're a fellow film junkie and creator, I would love to connect and chat more. Peace.